A Rome in mourning. The summer of AD 65 in Rome was not simply another season. It was the moment when the empire's heartbeat faltered, for Empress Poppaea Sabina, Nero's cherished consort, was gone. Ancient sources disagree on the manner of her death. Tacitus claimed Nero, in a fit of rage, had kicked her while she was pregnant. Suetonius suggested something more sordid, a domestic quarrel spiralling out of control. Cassius Dio, ever fond of lurid detail, leaned into the cruelty of it. Scholars still debate whether any of these stories are literal truth, or whether Rome's historians, hostile to Nero, embroidered her passing to highlight his monstrosity. What is certain is that Poppaea's sudden absence tore through Nero's fragile sense of identity. Imagine the scene in the imperial palace, drapes drawn, incense burned, and a court frozen in apprehension. The city outside continued with the rhythms of bread ovens and chariots, yet inside the Palatine Hill, one young emperor sat stunned, mourning, and unpredictable. Nero was only in his late 20s. He had been groomed for power since boyhood, but without Poppaea, he seemed more like an orphan than a ruler. She had not just been his wife, she was his anchor, his mirror, and in many ways his guide to presenting himself as a godlike sovereign. Roman mourning customs were elaborate. Masks of ancestors might be carried in funeral processions, and noble families turned grief into civic theatre. Yet Nero's grief was of another scale. He reportedly forbade Poppaea's cremation at first, lavishing perfumes and spices upon her body, preserving her in a bizarre parody of Egyptian mummification. Rome was startled by the extravagance. Frankincense and cinnamon, luxuries usually rationed by the handful, were poured in heaps, as though Rome's eastern trade were nothing but Nero's personal vault. One odd account even insists he had her embalmed with rare resins never before seen in Italy. Beyond the rituals, there was a political tremor. Poppaea had wielded influence in courtly circles, shaping alliances, soothing enemies, and offering counsel. Without her, factions stirred uneasily. Whispers spread. Was her death an accident, or proof that Nero's rule had curdled into dangerous chaos? Senators, never fond of him, exchanged knowing glances. The people, for all their love of spectacle, sensed a shift in the emperor's performance. In grief, humans often cling to memory. Nero clung harder, unable to let go. His obsession with the lost empress became the root of an eerie transformation in his private life, one that would spill onto the public stage. Here, the seeds of Sporus's fate were sown. And so Rome, outwardly bustling with commerce, gladiatorial contests, and prayers to Jupiter, was quietly entering a new chapter of dread. For the emperor who had once fancied himself a poet and actor now played the role of widower, bereft, unstable, and searching desperately for a replacement no mortal could provide. This was no ordinary mourning. It was a wound that would soon lead to one of the most disturbing tales in imperial history, where grief, desire, and unchecked power collided to reshape the life of an unsuspecting boy. Nero the Unmoored. With Poppaea gone, Nero drifted like a ship without rudder or sail. The Julio-Claudian dynasty had produced emperors of formidable presence: Augustus the founder, Tiberius the brooding strategist, Claudius the reluctant scholar. But Nero was different. He fancied himself less a general and more a performer, craving applause as much as obedience. Without Poppaea at his side, guiding and tempering his impulses, the emperor's mask slipped further into eccentricity. Ancient writers describe him wandering palace corridors, alternately weeping, composing verses, or staging rehearsals of songs meant to immortalize his grief. One detail, perhaps exaggerated, tells of him ordering singers to perform laments day and night, a macabre soundtrack to his sorrow. Scholars still debate whether these accounts reflect truth, or whether they were carefully chosen anecdotes meant to belittle his reign. Regardless, the picture is clear. Rome's emperor, barely 30, was unravelling before the eyes of his court. Unmoored emperors are dangerous. Nero began indulging the darker side of his imagination, dreaming up ways to outdo the gods themselves in sorrow and devotion. Some claimed he compared his loss to the grief of Paris for Helen, or of Achilles for Patroclus. Rome's poets and playwrights, dependent on imperial patronage, dared not contradict him. If their emperor wished to be seen as a tragic hero, they obliged, weaving myth and grief into flattery. At the same time, the political reality was turning hostile. The Pisonian conspiracy, uncovered only a year earlier, had left Nero paranoid. Senators eyed him warily. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite protectors, had grown uneasy with his theatrical excess. To ordinary Romans, his public displays of grief were baffling. Rome expected solemn dignity, not operatic spectacle. Yet amidst this storm, Nero longed not for polity, stability, but for companionship. He sought not a new empress in the traditional sense, for no woman could replace Poppaea in his mind. Instead, his grief transmuted into something stranger, a desire to recreate what he had lost. That yearning soon fixed upon an unlikely figure, a beautiful youth whose face bore, some claimed, a haunting resemblance to the dead empress. This youth's name was Sporus. At first, he was merely another boy in Rome, one of many adolescents who passed through the city's labyrinth of households and patronage. But to Nero, still adrift, Sporus shimmered like a mirage in the desert. He was not Poppaea, yet in Nero's grief-clouded imagination he could be remade into her likeness. Fringe accounts, passed down more as rumour than record, suggest that Nero even toyed with astrological readings and omens, searching for signs that destiny permitted such a substitution. Perhaps, in his eyes, fate had delivered Sporus as a vessel through which Poppaea might live again. Scholars still debate whether this was delusion, calculated symbolism, or simply propaganda recorded by hostile chroniclers to tarnish Nero's name. For now, Sporus remained an ordinary boy, unaware of the role he was about to play in the emperor's desperate theatre of grief. But the stage was being set. Nero, the unmoored emperor, would soon demand from him a sacrifice as chilling as it was irreversible. A boy named Sporus. Sporus first appears in the surviving record as if conjured from shadow. His origins are obscure, his family lost in silence. Rome in the 1st century was a city of dazzling splendour and suffocating anonymity. A boy could rise to prominence as a page in a noble household or remain nameless in the throngs at the forum. Sporus, by some twist of fate, found himself noticed by the emperor. What drew Nero's gaze remains uncertain. Some ancient sources whisper of a delicate beauty, features uncannily reminiscent of Poppaea Sabina. Others claim it was mere chance, a youth plucked from obscurity. Scholars still debate whether Sporus had aristocratic connections, or if he was simply a convenient figure whose appearance fit Nero's grief-fueled imagination. The Rome of Sporus's youth was a city alive with contradictions. Senators in purple-trimmed togas paraded through marble colonnades, while slaves carried water from public fountains to crowded insulae. Gladiators fought in wooden amphitheatres before the Colosseum's construction, and fortune-tellers thrived near the Circus Maximus. Against this backdrop, Sporus would have been just another boy, until summoned into Nero's orbit. From that moment, his life ceased to belong to him. One can imagine the first meeting, Nero restless in the Palatine Palace, surrounded by sycophants eager to distract him, and then Sporus enters. Perhaps he carried a message, perhaps he performed some minor task, but to Nero he seemed more than mortal. His likeness to the dead empress was not perfect, yet in grief's distortion, Nero saw a reflection of what he had lost. It was enough. The emperor, who could command armies and crush senatorial plots, now fixated on a single youth, as though he had discovered an answer to his mourning. What did Sporus feel in that moment? The sources are silent. He left behind no words, no testimony, only the interpretations of others. Some modern scholars speculate that Sporus, like many youths in Rome, had little agency. To be chosen by the emperor was less an honour than a sentence. Others suggest he may have been overwhelmed by sudden privilege, food, clothing, and proximity to power. Still others argue that he was simply terrified, aware that Nero's affections were as lethal as they were intoxicating. Scholars still debate whether Sporus was victim, participant, or both in the strange drama that followed. There are traces of small details in later accounts. Cassius Dio notes his resemblance to Poppaea. Suetonius describes him only in passing, as though his personhood mattered less than the scandal he embodied. In the margins of history, Sporus is at once vivid and ghostly, a boy defined not by his own deeds, but by what Nero demanded of him. It is worth remembering that Rome was not entirely alien in its treatment of beauty and power. Actors, gladiators, and even poets could become objects of imperial fascination, but Nero's fixation crossed into territory that unsettled even his contemporaries. He did not merely dote upon Sporus. He imagined a transformation, a metamorphosis that would blur the line between mourning and obsession, cruelty and intimacy. For Sporus, the gaze of the emperor was both spotlight and snare. His fate had begun its inexorable turn, though he could scarcely have understood, in those early encounters, the depth of the role Nero intended him to play. He was not simply to be admired. He was to become, in a sense, chillingly literal, the living echo of the empress who had died. The castration command. The decision, when it came, was chilling in its clarity. Nero, still racked by grief and unable to reconcile himself to Poppaea's absence, commanded that Sporus be castrated. In a society where power was often expressed through spectacle, this was spectacle at its most personal and most cruel. Castration was not unknown in the Roman world. Eunuchs served in Eastern courts, particularly in Persia and among certain Greek-speaking communities, but in Rome it was viewed with suspicion, even disgust. To order such a thing for a Roman boy was a transgression that shocked contemporaries. Suetonius preserves the detail most starkly, noting that Nero had a boy named Sporus castrated and actually tried to make a woman of him. The phrasing, blunt and almost incredulous, captures how Romans themselves struggled to comprehend it. Cassius Dio adds another layer. The act was done because Sporus resembled Poppaea, and Nero could not bear her loss. Scholars still debate whether this was purely Nero's grief-driven delusion, or whether hostile historians emphasized the cruelty to vilify him further. Whatever the motive, the outcome was irreversible. Picture the scene. In a chamber of the imperial palace, physicians summoned, instruments prepared, attendants hovering nervously. Sporus, a teenager on the cusp of manhood, confronted with a command that could not be refused. No records tell us his words, his cries, or his silence. We are left only to imagine the fear that must have flooded him. For Nero, the act was less about Sporus himself than about reshaping reality, forcing the boy into a living sculpture moulded by imperial will. The practice of reshaping others into roles they did not choose was not unique to Nero. Emperors often used marriage, adoption, or ritual to bend people into symbols of continuity and legitimacy. But here, the symbolism was grotesque. Nero wanted not just a wife, but Poppaea reborn, a phantom conjured through flesh and violence. In this, the private and the political collided. By making Sporus a bride, Nero also made a statement. The emperor's desire could overturn nature itself. Some fringe anecdotes, whispered even in antiquity, claimed Nero justified the act with reference to mythology. Just as Ganymede, the beautiful boy abducted by Zeus, was made immortal, so too would Sporus be transformed. Others suggest Nero invoked Cybele, the Eastern goddess served by self-castrated priests, presenting the act as quasi-religious. Scholars still debate whether such justifications were real or later inventions by authors seeking to frame Nero's cruelty in familiar mythic terms. The castration of Sporus was not simply physical, it was symbolic, a rewriting of identity. Rome, a city steeped in rigid gender roles, now had to contend with a figure who embodied both scandal and spectacle. Sporus had been made into something unprecedented, not quite man, not quite woman, but an imperial construct. In the dim light of the palace, Nero might have looked upon the boy and seen Poppaea returned, a grotesque echo of love lost. Yet outside those walls, whispers grew louder. Senators, courtiers, and ordinary citizens began to murmur about their emperor's madness. The act could not be hidden forever, and soon Rome would be confronted with a wedding that made mockery of marriage itself, a wedding of shadows. Not long after the castration, Nero staged a ceremony that stunned Rome. The emperor married Sporus. It was not a private arrangement, not a discreet indulgence behind palace walls, but a public spectacle, complete with all the trappings of a traditional Roman wedding. The accounts we inherit describe it with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. Suetonius and Cassius Dio, always eager to underline Nero's excesses, insist that the rituals were followed to the letter. Scholars still debate whether the ceremony truly mirrored Roman custom in detail, or whether later writers exaggerated it to make Nero appear more grotesque. In any case, the performance was unmistakable. Sporus, adorned in the bridal veil of the flammeum, stood as the bride. Attendants carried torches. There was the joining of hands, the solemn vows, even the festive cries that usually followed the union of a man and woman. Yet here the roles were inverted. The emperor, robed in authority, took the boy as his wife before a watching court. Rome's social fabric, built upon patriarchal order, was bent into theatre. It is not difficult to imagine the reactions. Courtiers, bound by loyalty or fear, applauded dutifully. The Praetorian Guard, standing stiff at attention, betrayed nothing. Behind closed doors, senators surely muttered into their cups of wine, wondering how long such outrages could continue. For ordinary Romans, accustomed to gossip at the baths or marketplace, the story must have travelled like wildfire. Some laughed, others were appalled. A few, perhaps, pitied the boy veiled at the emperor's side. Nero, however, revelled in the symbolism. To him, the wedding was not mockery but triumph. He had recreated Poppaea, defying death by shaping Sporus into her likeness. Just as an actor dons a mask and convinces an audience, Nero had staged his greatest performance. In this, he blurred the line between grief and delusion, turning mourning into pageantry. There is a curious tidbit preserved by Cassius Dio. During the ceremony, some guests whispered that if Poppaea herself could see, she might weep or laugh. This comment, half rumour and half satire, captures the strangeness of the moment. Rome was a city steeped in ritual, yet here ritual was bent into parody. Scholars still debate whether the wedding was intended as private catharsis or deliberate provocation, another way for Nero to assert that his will outweighed tradition itself. The marriage was not a one-day spectacle. Nero referred to Sporus as Sabina, using Poppaea's name. He introduced him to others as his empress. When they travelled together, Sporus was treated with the ceremonial dignity of a queen. For Nero, the boy was no longer Sporus. He was Poppaea, reborn, at least in the theatre of the emperor's imagination. But shadows clung to the union. The wedding might have been dressed in silk and song, but beneath it lay violence, coercion, and fear. Sporus, whose body had been reshaped, now lived not as himself, but as an echo of someone else. He had been bound to the emperor by ritual, but also by the chains of necessity. No record tells us his feelings, yet the silence is deafening. Was he numb, resigned, terrified, Or did he, in some fragile way, adapt to survive? Scholars still debate whether Sporus's silence was compliance, resistance, or simply the erasure of his voice by those who told his story. Rome had witnessed many strange unions in its history, alliances between generals and heiresses, marriages brokered for power. But never before had the empire seen a boy transformed into a bride to soothe an emperor's grief. This wedding of shadows set the stage for an even more unsettling theatre, the life of Sporus as empress in all but name, the imperial spectacle. The marriage of Nero and Sporus might have been shocking in its intimacy, but it did not remain hidden behind palace doors. Nero, ever the performer, made sure his new bride was seen, admired, and discussed. Their union spilled into Rome's public life, transforming into a spectacle that blurred the boundaries between private indulgence and political theatre. If Rome had been bewildered by the wedding itself, the weeks and months that followed only deepened the sense that their emperor had turned governance into stagecraft. In public appearances, Sporus was dressed as an empress. He wore jewels, once belonging to Poppaea, draped in silks and veils, and accompanied Nero to festivals, banquets, and even official functions. The emperor treated him not as a hidden concubine, but as a consort, elevating him to visibility in a role Romans could scarcely process. To see a boy, remade into a woman by imperial decree, parading through ceremonies was at once titillating and unsettling. Suetonius, writing with evident disgust, describes Nero parading Sporus through Rome's streets like a wife. Cassius Dio, meanwhile, recounts how Nero even staged mock nuptials more than once, repeating the ceremony with different audiences, as though the scandal itself was part of the entertainment. Scholars still debate whether these accounts reflect literal truth or the satirical exaggeration of hostile historians. Yet the repetition of the theme across sources suggests at least some public display did occur. One quirky anecdote hints at Nero's obsession with spectacle. During theatrical contests, where he himself performed as singer and actor, he sometimes brought Sporus into the audience dressed as empress, as though ensuring Poppaea's gaze followed him even from beyond the grave. Was this grief, exhibitionism, or calculated defiance of Roman norms? Scholars still do debate whether Nero sought to provoke outrage, or whether he was simply blind to it, lost in his own theatre. The people of Rome were not strangers to eccentric emperors. Caligula had dressed as a god, parading through the city in golden armour. Claudius had married his niece Agrippina in defiance of law. Yet Nero's presentation of Sporus touched on something deeper, because it tampered with gender, ritual, and memory all at once. To call a boy Sabina was to overwrite identity, a gesture that many found grotesque. Still, laughter and gossip often tempered outrage. In marketplaces and taverns, Romans may have joked about the emperor's peculiar bride, mocking the court's pretences even as they endured them. And yet there was menace beneath the spectacle. Those who snickered too loudly risked reprisal. Nero's reign was marked by fear as much as extravagance, and satire could be fatal if it crossed the wrong ears. Thus, Rome lived in a paradox, a city buzzing with rumour, yet silenced by the threat of imperial wrath. The spectacle of Sporus was both open secret and forbidden topic, a performance that everyone saw but few dared to name. For Nero, however, the union seemed to heal, or at least to distract. With Sporus beside him, dressed as empress, he could pretend Poppaea still lingered, that death had not robbed him. For Sporus, the spectacle was survival, even as it erased him. Day by day, he became less a boy and more a symbol, a living prop in an emperor's theatre. And for Rome, the sight of this strange partnership was yet another reminder that their ruler's grief had turned into a public madness. Rome's uneasy whispers. The marriage and spectacle of Sporus did not pass quietly into Rome's memory. The city thrived on gossip, from the lofty halls of the Senate to the chatter of bathhouses and taverns. Every gesture of the emperor became fodder for commentary, and the boy in the bridal veil was no exception. Behind the forced smiles of courtiers and the stiff applause of guards, Rome murmured. Those murmurs, uneasy and half-suppressed, carried both fascination and dread. Senators, whose dignity was already bruised by Nero's disdain, found new cause for contempt. The union with Sporus struck them not merely as scandalous, but as humiliating for the Roman state. Marriage was the foundation of lineage and property, an institution binding elite families together. To turn it into theatre with a boy-turned-bride felt like mockery of the very class that once gave emperors legitimacy. Tacitus, writing later, described the Senate under Nero as a body drained of vitality, forced into silence even as it seethed. Scholars still debate whether senators truly voiced resistance to the Sporus affair, or whether their outrage was retroactively embroidered by historians who loathed Nero. Among the people, reactions were more varied. Some viewed the emperor's behaviour with amused detachment. After all, Nero's reign was full of excess, from chariot racing to singing competitions. To them, the boy bride was simply another oddity in a reign defined by oddities. Others, however, whispered darker thoughts, that Rome's order itself was unravelling. If an emperor could erase gender and remake a youth into an empress, what law, what custom, was safe from violation? One fringe anecdote, almost certainly coloured by satire, tells of market sellers joking that perhaps Nero would next marry his horse, echoing the tales once told of Caligula. Whispers also spread abroad. Diplomats and envoys carried stories back to their homelands, that Rome's emperor had married a castrated boy, paraded him as empress, and demanded recognition of the union. The empire's prestige was such that allies and client kings bowed regardless, but the strangeness of the tale left its mark. Scholars still debate whether these whispers influenced the perception of Rome among its eastern subjects, who were more accustomed to eunuchs and courtiers of ambiguous gender than their Roman counterparts. Fear shaped the whispers too. The Pisonian conspiracy of AD 65 had shown that Nero's enemies could be rooted out and executed in swathes. Those who spoke too freely of Sporus risked accusation of mockery or treason. Thus, Rome learned to whisper in riddles, cloaking satire in allegory. Poets compared Nero to mythic figures, not to Augustus or Jupiter, but to Pygmalion, the sculptor who fell in love with his own statue. In these veiled words, Sporus was the statue, shaped, silenced, displayed. The boy himself remained elusive. No record tells us how Sporus navigated the whispers. Did he hear the laughter in the markets, or sense the chill in senatorial glances? Or was he shielded by the palace walls, living in a strange cocoon where he was both mocked and exalted? Scholars still debate whether Sporus was complicit in sustaining the illusion for survival, or whether he was simply carried along by forces far beyond his control. By this point, Nero's reign was no longer defined by administration or military triumphs, but by rumour, scandal, and fear. The whispers about Sporus were only one thread in a wider tapestry of unease. Accusations of waste, rumours of arson, suspicions of plots. Yet the image of a boy empress at the emperor's side lingered like a ghost, a symbol of a Rome both fascinated and horrified by its ruler. Echoes of myth. Rome was a city that breathed myth. Every ritual, every triumphal arch, every coin carried whispers of gods and heroes. For Nero, who saw himself not merely as emperor, but as performer and poet, myth was more than background. It was stage lighting for his reign. In Sporus, the boy remade into empress, Nero found an opportunity to weave myth into reality, cloaking his unsettling act in divine echoes. Ancient accounts suggest Nero likened Sporus to Persephone, the queen of the underworld. In Greek myth, Persephone had been seized by Hades and carried below, forced to inhabit a role not of her choosing. For Rome's literate elite, the parallel was obvious. Sporus, taken from youth, reshaped by force, cast into the role of bride. Cassius Dio even records that Nero sometimes addressed him publicly as Sabina, Poppaea's name, but also hinted at Persephone's title. Scholars still debate whether this was a deliberate invocation of myth or a later flourish added by authors eager to dramatize the story. Other myths clung to the union. Comparisons to Ganymede, the beautiful boy abducted by Zeus, were whispered in satirical verse. Ganymede became cupbearer to the gods, symbol of divine desire. Sporus, paraded in silks, was cast as Rome's reluctant echo. Some fringe anecdotes suggest Nero even staged mock performances, presenting Sporus in roles from mythology during court banquets, as though turning life itself into theatre. One tale, likely exaggerated, claims he arranged for Sporus to appear in a tableau as a goddess rising from the sea, flanked by attendants carrying seashells and pearls. The invocation of myth was not innocent. In Rome, emperors often wrapped themselves in legendary comparison. Augustus had claimed descent from Venus through Aeneas. Caligula dressed as Mercury and Venus alike. By tying Sporus to Persephone or Ganymede, Nero was asserting more than personal obsession. He was crafting imperial narrative. Just as gods defied mortal norms, so too could he. Rome's rules of gender, tradition, and law bent before his will. Yet not all found the myth-making convincing. Satirists mocked it as grotesque theatre, an emperor dressing delusion in the costume of legend. Senators, ever wary of impropriety, bristled at the idea that sacred myth could be used to justify scandal. And among the people, laughter cut through reverence. One rumour suggests that street poets sang of Persephone not descending to the underworld, but being dragged to Nero's bedchamber. Scholars still debate whether such verses ever circulated openly, or whether they were later inventions to highlight the depth of mockery Nero endured. Still, the mythic language lingered, seeping into Rome's collective imagination. To call Sporus Sabina was to resurrect Poppaea. To call him Persephone was to legitimize the emperor's appropriation of divine narrative. And to compare him with Ganymede was to remind all that even gods broke boundaries of age, power, and consent. Behind these myths, however, remained a human boy. Sporus was no goddess, no echo of Poppaea, no symbol of Persephone's descent. He was flesh and blood, reshaped against his will, bound to an emperor's grief and delusion. Yet, through Nero's myth-making, his humanity blurred. To the world, he became emblem and story, a character in an imperial myth that could not be escaped. And so, while Rome whispered of Persephone and Ganymede, within the palace Sporus lived out the strange reality of those myths, navigating a role scripted by the emperor and performed on the stage of empire. Behind palace walls, beyond the streets and whispers, life with Nero unfolded in the private world of the imperial palace. Behind the marble facades and gilded halls, Sporus's existence became something stranger than legend, an intimate routine at once exalted and suffocating. Here, out of public sight, the emperor's obsessions were lived day by day, with Sporus caught in their centre. The Roman palace was no quiet sanctuary. It pulsed with attendants, guards, musicians, and slaves. Banquets could erupt at any hour, filled with the clatter of silver plates, the scent of roasted meats, and the drone of lyres. Nero delighted in constant entertainment. He sang, he recited poetry, he commanded guests to applaud. In this environment, Sporus was not merely present, he was on display. Dressed as empress, Adorned in silks and pearls, he sat beside Nero as though Poppaea herself had returned to life. Scholars still debate whether Sporus was treated with genuine affection or whether he was more ornament than companion. Inside these walls, the emperor's moods dictated everything. When Nero was playful, the palace glittered with performances, drunken games, and improvisations. He staged plays where courtiers were forced to act, sometimes humiliating them in front of peers. One quirky anecdote tells of him pretending to give birth, crying out theatrically while attendants played midwives, an echo, some claimed, of Poppaea's fatal pregnancy. Sporus, positioned as empress, may have been made to participate in such grotesque charades. Scholars still debate whether this anecdote is reliable or simply hostile satire meant to caricature Nero's excess. When Nero was melancholic, the palace grew tense. He would sit in silence, strumming his kithara or pacing corridors at night. Sporus's role in those moments is invisible in the record, yet we can imagine the pressure upon him. He was expi, seated to soothe, to embody Poppaea's absence, to be both comfort and ghost. Whether he offered words, gestures, or simply presence, his every action was shaped by the knowledge that displeasing Nero could be fatal. The intimacy between them, however defined, was not without its complexities. Nero bestowed gifts upon Sporus, rings, fine fabrics, perhaps estates managed by imperial agents. He addressed him as Sabina, and in private audiences with courtiers introduced him as his empress. To live behind those walls was to inhabit a contradiction, both elevated to ceremonial dignity and trapped in a gilded cage. Rumours also suggest Nero delighted in parading Sporus before foreign guests, as though daring them to question the emperor's choices. Diplomats from the East, accustomed to eunuchs in royal courts, may have shown little surprise. To Romans, however, the sight was disorienting. The palace had become a theatre of inversion, where tradition bent under the weight of one man's desire. And yet, despite the extravagance, there must have been moments of quiet. Perhaps Sporus walked in the palace gardens, where fountains trickled and laurel groves shaded marble paths. Perhaps he gazed at frescoed ceilings painted with mythic lovers, wondering if he too was only a figure in a story not his own. In those moments, his humanity peeks faintly through the cracks left by the ancient chroniclers. Behind the palace walls, Sporus lived in a space where grief, spectacle, and fear intertwined. To the city outside, he was empress. To Nero, he was Poppaea reborn. But to himself, we will never know. Scholars still debate whether he found strategies of survival in this gilded prison, or whether each day was endured like a role in a play, whose ending he could not yet see. A bride on display. Life behind palace walls was one kind of captivity, life beyond them was another. Nero did not keep Sporus hidden. Instead, he displayed him before the empire, taking him on journeys where the boy was no longer just a private companion, but a public emblem. It was a performance staged across provinces, theatres, and triumphal routes, and it ensured that Sporus's role as empress became not rumour, but spectacle witnessed by thousands. One of the most notable journeys took place when Nero travelled to Greece in AD 66. Obsessed with Greek culture, he wished to present himself as both emperor and artist, competing in contests and performing on stage. Sporus accompanied him, veiled and jewelled, introduced not as a youth but as Sabina. Suetonius remarks that he was treated with the full dignity of an empress, standing beside Nero during ceremonies, applauded as though he were Poppaea returned. Scholars still debate whether this detail reflects actual protocol or whether later historians amplified it for dramatic effect. The journey to Greece was itself drenched in theatre. Nero participated in Olympic Games, singing in contests where judges dared not deny him victory. He ordered cities to erect statues, and at one point he even began digging a canal across the Isthmus of Corinth, striking the first spade of earth while crowds shouted acclamations. Through all of this, Sporus was present, an ever-visible reminder of Nero's peculiar grief turned to obsession. One quirky anecdote suggests that in Corinth, Nero staged a mock wedding procession, with Sporus leading the way as bride. Garlands, music, and even dowry chests were paraded, as though reenacting their Roman nuptials for a Greek audience. The tale may be exaggerated, but it reflects the fusion of politics and theatre that defined Nero's reign. Scholars still debate whether such processions were isolated spectacles or recurring events staged for effect. Beyond Greece, Sporus travelled with Nero to other parts of the empire. Wherever the emperor went, rumours followed. The castrated boy treated as empress, seated at the emperor's side, part of the official entourage. To subjects in the provinces, these appearances were bewildering, yet unavoidable. Few dared to comment openly. After all, loyalty was safer than satire. For Nero, displaying Sporus was more than personal indulgence. It was imperial propaganda of a strange kind. By showing the boy beside him, Nero proclaimed that even death could not rob him of Poppaea, that his love defied mortality itself. To his mind, this was grandeur. To many observers, it was grotesque. The image of Sporus in procession, his face veiled, his body draped in imperial finery, was not one Rome could forget. He had become not just a person, but a symbol of Nero's eccentricity, of his disregard for custom, of the emperor's strange blend of grief and exhibitionism. And yet, behind the jewels and garments, Sporus remained a boy with no voice in the matter. Carried across seas, displayed on stages, his body and identity had been rewritten for the sake of an emperor's narrative. Scholars still debate whether he ever adjusted to the role thrust upon him, finding ways to survive its burdens, or whether each public appearance deepened the trauma of being paraded as someone he was not. Thus, Sporus moved from Rome's whispers to the wider empire's gaze, no longer hidden behind palace walls, but thrust into the glare of imperial display. The boy who might have lived in anonymity was now spectacle incarnate, a bride on display, the living emblem of an emperor's grief-turned delusion, mock triumphs. In the Rome of Nero, spectacle often masqueraded as victory. Traditional triumphs, the grand parades awarded to generals who had won decisive battles, were rare and sacred, bound by centuries of ritual. Yet Nero, ever more enthralled by performance than conquest, staged his own versions, mock triumphs, where he, the emperor, paraded not as conqueror of nations, but as master of theatre. And always Sporus was there, draped in bridal finery, woven into the strange pageantry. Ancient sources describe Nero returning from Greece in AD 68 as though from war, parading his victories not over enemies, but over Greek audiences who had awarded him crowns for singing and acting. Sporus was part of this entourage, presented as empress to the cheering, or perhaps coerced, crowds. Suetonius mocks the absurdity, writing that Nero celebrated a triumph for his lyre. Scholars still debate whether the procession through Rome was a literal parody of triumphal form, or whether historians later exaggerated it as satire. The symbolism was striking. Triumphs were the pinnacle of Roman masculinity, celebrating military power, discipline, and conquest. Yet here was Nero, entering the city not in armour, but in theatrical costume, accompanied not by legionaries, but by actors, singers, and Sporus, the castrated boy dressed as Poppaea. For many Romans, it must have felt like inversion, even blasphemy. A sacred rite had been hollowed into mock theatre. One fringe anecdote claims Nero even staged a mock ovation, a lesser form of triumph, in which Sporus rode beside him in a chariot, hailed as though she were Augusta. The detail may be fanciful, but it illustrates the way Sporus was integrated into the emperor's public theatre. He was not hidden but displayed, his very presence a challenge to tradition. For the Roman people, reactions were complex. Some laughed, finding dark humour in the emperor's absurdities. Others, especially veterans who had bled for Rome's real triumphs, seethed at the parody. Still others remained silent, for silence was safer. To mock too openly was to risk one's life. Rome's culture of satire had long thrived in streets and taverns, but under Nero, satire carried the weight of treason. Scholars still debate whether the people's laughter was open rebellion or merely whispered defiance contained within private circles. For Sporus, these mock triumphs meant endless exposure. He was compelled to stand before crowds as though embodying the legitimacy of an empress, yet his identity was a fiction. To walk in these parades was to live in a play where the script denied his humanity. Imagine the moment, the sound of trumpets, the clatter of hooves, the emperor basking in applause, while beside him, veiled and silent, Sporus bore the weight of eyes that saw both scandal and pity. Mock triumphs were more than indulgence. They were Nero's statement that art and theatre outweighed blood and conquest. He saw himself as victor not on battlefields but on stages, not through soldiers but through song. And in this strange vision, Sporus was indispensable. The boy bride was part of the tableau, proof that Nero could rewrite not only Rome's rituals, but reality itself. Yet every parody has its edge. In undermining the triumph, Nero undermined himself. The spectacle that he intended as glory became, in the eyes of many Romans, further proof that their emperor had slipped into delusion. And as Sporus stood beside him, enshrined in silk yet emptied of self, the boy became a symbol of that delusion, a mock empress in a mock triumph, carried along by an emperor who mistook theatre for truth, a court of fear. While Nero revelled in his spectacles, the atmosphere within his court grew heavy with dread. The palace, for all its glittering mosaics and perfumed corridors, was a place where loyalty was demanded, not earned. To survive in Nero's orbit meant watching every word, every glance, every gesture. For even a whispered jest could be construed as treason, and treason often ended in blood. The memory of the Pisonian conspiracy of AD 65 still haunted Rome. Senators, knights, poets, and even officers of the Praetorian Guard had been implicated in the plot to remove Nero. The response was brutal. Executions swept through the city, and figures such as the Stoic philosopher Seneca, once Nero's tutor, were forced into suicide. The lesson was clear. Resistance, even silence mistaken for resistance, could be fatal. Scholars still debate whether Nero's paranoia was justified by genuine threats or inflated by his own insecurity and theatrical sense of danger. In this atmosphere, Sporus was both centerpiece and hostage. Courtiers were required to treat him with the deference owed to an empress. They bowed, they offered gifts, they praised his appearance, all while suppressing their unease. To mock him openly was to mock Nero's grief, and that could invite execution. Thus, a boy who might once have been an object of ridicule became instead a test of loyalty, a mirror in which every courtier's survival instinct was reflected. One quirky anecdote preserved by later writers claims that during banquets, Nero would force his guests to toast Sporus as though he were Augusta, the empress of Rome. The moment was absurd, yet dangerous. To hesitate, to laugh, even to raise a brow in disbelief, could be fatal. Imagine the scene, a hall filled with senators and generals, forced to clink goblets toward a veiled youth in bridal robes, while the emperor watched, waiting for signs of death. As loyalty, Scholars still debate whether this anecdote records actual practice or whether it was exaggerated to illustrate the terror of the court. Fear extended beyond the palace walls. Informers thrived in Nero's Rome, men who made careers out of reporting suspicious comments. A stray word in the baths, a joke whispered at dinner, could lead to arrest. The presence of Sporus magnified this tension. His very role was scandalous, but to question it aloud was to risk everything. Thus, Rome learned to practice double speech, laughter in private, silence in public, and endless praise before the emperor. For Sporus himself, the court of fear was another prison layered atop the gilded one he already inhabited. His body had been remade, his name replaced, his identity recast. Now even the smiles around him were masks of terror, not companionship. He was exalted yet isolated, treated with ceremony yet stripped of autonomy. Was he aware of the fear he inspired, the way courtiers bent their words around him? Or was he so consumed by his own survival that the wider dread hardly registered? Scholars still debate whether Sporus had any agency in shaping his role, or whether he was simply the silent axis around which fear revolved. Within this world of fear, Nero thrived. His tyranny was sustained not merely by soldiers, but by the silence of those too frightened to oppose him. And Sporus, the boy turned bride, became both symbol and instrument of that silence, a figure whose presence reminded Rome that even the most grotesque of imperial whims must be endured. Historians ink. Much of what we know of Sporus comes not from his own voice, lost forever in silence, but from the pens of Rome's historians. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, writing decades later, turned him into a figure less of flesh and more of symbol, folded neatly into their narratives about Nero's decline. Their ink preserved his name, but also distorted it, shaping Sporus into a lens through which the emperor's cruelty and madness could be magnified. Tacitus, the sober moralist, largely brushed over the details, focusing instead on the corrosive effects of Nero's reign upon Rome's institutions. To him, Sporus was one of many grotesque signs of a state in decay. Suetonius, ever fond of lurid anecdotes, leaned into the scandal, highlighting Nero's marriage and Sporus's transformation as though recording a carnival of excess. Cassius Dio, writing in the Greek world centuries later, added dramatic embellishments, making Sporus a ghostly echo of Poppaea, paraded as though myth reborn. Scholars still debate whether Dio's flourishes reflect earlier traditions or whether he embroidered them to captivate his audience. What unites these accounts is their use of Sporus not as a person, but as evidence. He became the emperor's folly embodied, a cautionary tale of power without restraint. His humanity, his fears, his possible resilience, none of these mattered to chroniclers intent on painting Nero as a tyrant who blurred every boundary of custom and decency. Sporus's suffering was real, but in the historian's hands it became metaphor. Even in later centuries, Christian writers echoed these stories to portray pagan emperors as degenerate, contrasting their vices with the moral order of the church. In their retellings, Sporus symbolized corruption itself, the unnatural fruit of grief, lust, and unchecked imperial authority. Thus, his story was recycled, stripped her of his individuality. Scholars still debate whether the persistence of his name across hostile accounts reflects his true significance in Rome, or whether it endures simply because his fate was too grotesque for storytellers to ignore. And yet, cracks in the narrative reveal something more. A few scattered remarks hint at Sporus's demeanour, quiet, compliant, perhaps even graceful under impossible pressure. These glimpses, faint as candlelight, suggest he was not merely a prop, but a human being struggling within the role imposed upon him. It is here that modern historians have begun to reconsider, asking not just what Sporus meant for Nero's image, but what Sporus's life might have been. Was he terrified each day, forced into silence by fear of death? or did he carve small strategies of survival, finding dignity where none was offered? Scholars still debate whether his presence at court should be read as total victimhood or as a complex negotiation of power. In truth, the boy who became an empress is both visible and invisible in the historical record. His name echoes through centuries, but his voice is absent. He is remembered less for who he was than for what he was made to represent. Ink preserved him, but it also erased him, leaving us with a haunting paradox, the most famous eunuch in Roman history, and yet still a stranger to us. A fragile human, strip away the legends, the satire, the mythic masks, and we arrive at something rawer, Sporus as a person, his body altered by force, his name repurposed, his life rewritten. He was still, beneath it all, a youth trying to exist in the shadow of Rome's most notorious emperor. To see him only as symbol is to perpetuate the erasure that began with Nero himself. To imagine him as human is to reclaim, however faintly, a voice denied for 2 millennia. The fragments we possess hint at a fragile existence. Sporus was paraded through Rome and abroad, called Sabina, dressed as empress. Yet when the ceremonies ended, when the banquets emptied, he must have faced moments of solitude. In those spaces, whether pacing a portico or sitting quietly in the palace gardens, he was neither Poppaea nor Augusta, but Sporus, a boy robbed of choice. Scholars still debate whether he internalized his role as survival or whether he clung silently to an identity that the empire had stripped away. There are, in fact, fleeting notes of sympathy even among hostile chroniclers. Cassius Dio, usually eager to paint Nero in grotesque colours, concedes that Sporus endured his role with a certain gravity. It is a rare acknowledgement that he was more than prop, that his presence, silent and constrained, carried its own dignity. One quirky anecdote, though difficult to verify, even suggests that Sporus won the quiet affection of some palace attendants, who admired his composure under circumstances they themselves could barely fathom. Scholars still debate whether these details were embellishments or genuine glimpses of the boy's inner resilience. Consider, too, the psychological toll. Rome's elite thrived on performance, rhetoric, theatre, spectacle, but for Sporus, performance was existence. Every gesture, every word, every appearance in silk and veil was a role rehearsed under threat of annihilation. How does one live under such conditions? Perhaps he compartmentalized, becoming Poppaea in public and Sporus in private, if such privacy was ever permitted. Or perhaps the boundaries blurred until he could no longer tell where the role ended and the self began. Modern readers may be tempted to cast Sporus in contemporary terms, to map him onto ideas of gender or identity as we understand them now. But Rome was not our world. For Nero, Sporus was Poppaea reborn. For Rome's chroniclers, he was a scandal. For himself, he may have been something neither named nor comprehensible to his society. Scholars still debate whether to interpret his story through modern frameworks or to accept that his life resists easy categories. And yet, in that resistance lies his humanity. He was fragile not because he was weak, but because he was human, trapped in forces larger than himself, yet still enduring. Fragility is often mistaken for helplessness, but in Sporus's case, it may also have been a form of strength. To survive day after day, to endure humiliation and spectacle, to continue walking beside an emperor who had rewritten his very body, that required resilience of a kind the historians never recorded, but which we can still imagine. So when we think of Sporus, we should not see only the veiled empress or the scandalous bride. We should see a boy in the shadows of marble halls, carrying a burden he never chose, living quietly in the eye of an imperial storm. His fragility was real, but so too, perhaps, was a dignity the chroniclers, blinded by scandal, could never quite erase. Nero's collapse. For years, Nero had strutted upon Rome's stage, weaving grief, theatre, and terror into one long performance. Yet every performance has its curtain. By AD 68, the empire's patience was fraying, provinces rebelled, generals defected, and the Praetorian Guard, once loyal protectors, began to whisper treason. The emperor who fancied himself singer, charioteer, and tragic hero now found himself the central actor in a drama of collapse, and at his side, still adorned as empress, stood Sporus, caught in the unravelling of a dynasty. The first cracks came from the provinces. In Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex raised revolt, decrying Nero's extravagance and tyranny. Spain followed suit under Galba, who proclaimed himself emperor. In Rome, rumours spread that the Senate no longer feared but despised their ruler. Even the Praetorian prefect, Nymphidius Sabinus, plotted against him. Scholars still debate whether these revolts were driven more by ideology or opportunism, resentment of Nero's reign, or simple ambition by rivals sensing weakness. Within the palace, fear grew sharper. The same courtiers who once toasted Sporus as Augusta now exchanged furtive glances, wondering whether the emperor's days were numbered. Yet Nero, characteristically theatrical, responded not with retreat but with more performance. One quirky anecdote tells that he prepared verses to be sung if he were executed, casting himself as a tragic martyr whose death would echo through eternity. He rehearsed his own demise like a role, as if reality itself were another stage. Sporus remained by him in these final days, a ghostly echo of Poppaea amid the empire's unravelling. What must he have felt, watching the man who had reshaped his life now crumble under the weight of rebellion? Did he fear his own fate, tethered as he was to the emperor's? Or did he feel a flicker of hope that Nero's fall might mean release? Scholars still debate whether Sporus's presence at this moment was voluntary or coerced, whether he stayed from loyalty, survival, or simply lack of choice. As the noose tightened, Nero grew frantic. He considered fleeing east to allies, even performing publicly as an actor to win the people's favour, but his supporters dwindled by the hour. When the Senate at last declared him a public enemy, even the Praetorians abandoned him. Alone, stripped of the adulation he had craved, Nero fled the palace in disguise, Sporus and a handful of loyal freedmen at his side. The images recorded are pitiful. The emperor, once wrapped in silk and gold, now stumbled through gardens in worn cloaks, hiding his face. Sporus, too, vanished into obscurity in those frantic hours, reduced once again to a silent presence in the shadows of imperial downfall. The boy who had once been paraded before Rome as empress was now a fugitive beside a man whose power evaporated like smoke. Rome had turned against its actor emperor. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, begun with Augustus a century earlier, was unravelling, and the strange, haunting story of Sporus, so bound up in Nero's grief and delusion, was about to be wrenched into an even darker chapter, as the curtain fell on Nero's life and a new chaos gripped the empire. Flight and death. The final act of Nero's life unfolded like a tragic play, yet without the applause he craved. In June of AD 68, Rome awoke to a startling proclamation. The Senate had declared Nero a public enemy. The man who once strode the stage as emperor, actor, and godlike figure was suddenly outlaw, stripped of every title. From that moment his flight began, an emperor reduced to fugitive, accompanied only by a handful of attendants, among them the silent figure of Sporus. Accounts of those hours vary, coloured by the biases of the historians. Suetonius insists Nero panicked, tearing his clothes and crying, "What an artist dies in me," as though mourning the loss of his stage more than his throne. Cassius Dio adds the detail that he contemplated escape to Egypt, imagining himself welcomed as a musician. Scholars still debate whether such details reflect his true words or the dramatic inventions of authors eager to frame him as theatrical even in death. The journey from palace to grave was desperate. Nero fled through gardens, fields, and side streets, often disguised in shabby cloaks. At one point, he reportedly begged peasants for a drink of water, a surreal image of Rome's emperor reduced to beggar. Sporus, once paraded as empress, now trudged beside him in obscurity, carrying the weight of a role that had lost its stage. One quirky anecdote claims Nero tried to dig a grave for himself with his bare hands, weeping as he realized his end was near. Eventually, he reached the villa of his freedman Phaon, just outside Rome. There, in a small chamber, Nero faced the choice he had long rehearsed in verse: to die by his own hand, or to be captured and humiliated. He lingered, torn between dread and pride. As soldiers closed in, he finally pressed a dagger to his throat, aided, so Suetonius tells us, by Epaphroditus, another loyal freedman. His last words, if we believe either sources, were, "Too late, this is fidelity," spoken with the flair of a dying actor delivering his final line. Scholars still debate whether these words were real or part of the literary theatre imposed by the chroniclers. With Nero's death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty ended. The boy who had once been groomed as heir to Augustus's line now lay in a shallow grave, abandoned by the empire he had ruled. Sporus, standing on the edge of this downfall, must have seen both terror and opportunity. His captor, his creator, his husband, whatever name Nero carried in Sporus's life, was gone. For the first time in years, Sporus's fate was no longer bound to Nero's will, yet freedom, if it could be called that, would prove as dangerous as captivity. Rome erupted in chaos after Nero's suicide. Galba, proclaimed emperor by the legions in Spain, marched toward the city. The Praetorian Guard shifted loyalties yet again. In this maelstrom, Sporus was carried along like flotsam in a storm. No longer Sabina, no longer the empress of Nero's grotesque theatre, he was once again just Sporus, a boy marked indelibly by what had been done to him and by what he had been forced to symbolize. But the empire had not finished with him. The story of Sporus did not end at the villa of Phaon. Instead, he was about to be swept into the power struggles of Rome's Year of the Four Emperors, passed from hand to hand like a relic of Nero's strange reign. Sporus with Otho. With Nero gone, Rome did not find peace. Instead, it plunged into a year of upheaval historians later called the Year of the Four Emperors. Galba, stern and frugal, seized power first, only to be slain within months. His successor, Marcus Salvius Otho, entered the stage next, and with him Sporus once more. For the boy who had lived as Nero's empress, this was not release, but another twist in the theatre of power. Otho had once been married to Poppaea Sabina, years before Nero claimed her as his own. That bond made his relationship with Sporus deeply symbolic. Some ancient writers insist that Otho took Sporus into his household as though reclaiming a fragment of Poppaea, a strange echo of his former wife. Suetonius hints that Sporus became Otho's consort, if not in marriage, then in public display. Scholars still debate whether this was fact or a literary flourish. Was Sporus truly treated as empress again, or merely paraded as a trophy to link Otho's reign to Nero's memory? The symbolism was powerful either way. By embracing Sporus, Otho could cast himself as heir to Nero's glamour, appealing to those who still mourned the fallen emperor. Many Romans, especially in the East, had revered Nero despite his scandals. Otho, pragmatic and ambitious, may have hoped to channel that nostalgia through the figure of Sporus. A quirky anecdote even suggests he introduced Sporus at feasts as Sabina, repeating Nero's practice, as though continuing the performance by which Poppaea's ghost haunted Rome. For Sporus, the shift from Nero to Otho was surely bewildering. Was he relieved to escape the volatility of Nero's moods, or was the repetition of his role, bride, empress, ornament, another prison? He had no say in the matter. Once again, he was not Sporus the youth, but Sporus the symbol, the living reminder of Poppaea Sabina. Scholars still debate whether he naviges this transition with resignation, or whether he sought quiet influence in Otho's brief reign. Otho's time on the throne was short and tragic. Within 3 months, Vitellius, backed by German legions, marched against him. The armies clashed at Bedriacum in northern Italy. Otho's forces were defeated. Facing the prospect of civil war and endless bloodshed, Otho chose to end his life. He fell on his sword in April AD 69, praised even by his enemies for the dignity of his death. And so, for the second time, Sporus lost the man who had defined his existence. He had been the empress of Nero and then the consort of Otho. Both had died violently, leaving him adrift once more. Yet Rome's hunger for theatre did not release him. Vitellius, Otho's rival and successor, soon claimed power, and with it claimed Sporus. In this way, Sporus became a ghost, passed from emperor to emperor, not for his own sake, but as a relic of continuity, a fragment of scandal too useful to ignore. His story, already extraordinary, was about to turn even darker under the rule of a man who would use him for spectacle far crueler than Nero's wedding processions, a pawn again. When Vitellius rose to power in AD 69, Sporus's fate took yet another grim turn. Unlike Nero, who had reshaped him out of grief, or Otho, who perhaps sought to reclaim echoes of Poppaea, Vitellius treated Sporus as little more than a pawn in the cruel theatre of politics. His reign was brief, but his appetite for spectacle was notorious, and Sporus became caught in it. Ancient sources claim Vitellius devised a plan so grotesque it still chills the imagination. He intended to use Sporus in a public display reenacting the myth of Proserpina, known to the Greeks as Persephone, being dragged into the underworld. In this performance, Sporus would play the goddess, abducted and violated before the eyes of Rome. It was not art but humiliation, turning the boy empress into the centerpiece of a brutal parody. Scholars still debate whether Vitellius genuinely prepared such a spectacle, or whether the story was later amplified to emphasize his cruelty. The symbolism was sharp. Under Nero, Sporus had been Persephone willingly invoked, a myth draped in veils and jewels to cloak the emperor's obsession. Under Vitellius, he was to be Persephone mocked, stripped of dignity, and made into theatre for derision. The same myth, inverted, revealed how fragile his constructed identity was. What had been exaltation was now degradation. One quirky detail from Cassius Dio suggests that preparations for the spectacle were already underway when Sporus learned of it. Costumes had been designed, and actors chosen to play Hades and his attendants. For the Romans, accustomed to cruel entertainments in the arena, this performance may not have seemed out of place, but for Sporus it would have been the final erasure of whatever humanity remained to him. Scholars still debate whether this anecdote reflects actual plans or merely served as a literary metaphor for the depths of Rome's decade. In these moments, we see the tragic continuity of Sporus's life, always displayed, never free. With Nero, he was a bride, with Otho, a consort, with Vitellius, a pawn for mockery. Each emperor used him not as a person but as symbol, reshaping his body and identity for their own needs. His silence in the record is deafening, yet it speaks volumes about the precariousness of survival in the imperial orbit. What must Sporus have felt, hearing whispers of the role he was to play? Perhaps despair, perhaps fury, perhaps a weary recognition that his body and name had always been theatre for others. But in Vitellius's Rome, the threat was unbearable. The myth of Persephone was no longer romanticized. It was an enactment of violation, a spectacle too degrading to endure, and so Sporus made a choice. Faced with yet another emperor who sought to bend him into grotesque theatre, he resolved to reclaim the one agency still left to him, the right to end his life. The final act. The story of Sporus had always been theatre, written by others, staged against his will. Yet in the end, he chose to script his own final act. When he learned of Vitellius's plan to parade him in a grotesque reenactment of Persephone's abduction, a spectacle of violation masquerading as myth, Sporus refused to play the part. With quiet resolve, he embraced the one freedom left to him. He took his own life. The sources are terse, almost reluctant in their details. Suetonius simply notes that Sporus chose death rather than endure outrage. Cassius Dio echoes this, recording that he refused to submit to insult and destroyed himself. Scholars still debate the manner of his death, whether it was by dagger, poison, or starvation. The method, however, matters less than the act itself. For the first time, Sporus's life was not stage-managed by an emperor's grief, lust, or cruelty. It was his own decision, carved from despair but also from defiance. It is tempting to view his end as tragedy alone. He was still only a youth, perhaps no older than his early 20s, marked by violence and erasure since the day Nero's gaze fell upon him. But there is a kind of dignity in his refusal. He had been Poppaea reborn, Persephone adorned, Ganymede paraded, Augusta mocked. At last he rejected every role imposed upon him. Death, though final, was his own line spoken against the empire's endless play. One quirky detail lingers in later retellings. Some Roman writers suggested Sporus's suicide was itself a kind of performance, a tragic gesture worthy of the stage Nero so adored. Whether this is embellishment or truth, it captures how even in death Sporus was interpreted as symbol. Scholars still debate whether his act should be remembered as resistance, as surrender, or simply as the inevitable end of a life stolen by power. Rome scarcely paused for his passing. Vitellius himself would soon be overthrown, dragged through the streets and killed by Vespasian's supporters. Civil war continued, emperors rose and fell, and the city moved on. Sporus left no descendants, no writings, no monuments. His life flickered briefly in the glare of imperial scandal, then vanished into shadow. Yet his silence is haunting. Few figures in history embody so starkly the cost of power's caprice. Sporus was neither general nor senator, neither poet nor philosopher. He was a boy who caught the eye of an emperor and was transformed into a living echo of another's grief. And in the end, he chose silence over degradation, a final act that was both tragedy and testament. Thus his story closes, not in applause, not in triumph, but in a quiet refusal. A fragile life consumed by empire, ending on his own terms. Legacy of shadows. When the dust of Rome's civil wars settled, Sporus was gone, and with him the fragile thread of his brief life. Yet his shadow lingered. In the centuries that followed, he became less a person than a story, a figure reshaped by every pen that wrote of Nero's reign. His name appears in histories, satires, and moral tales, always as symbol, rarely as human. The boy himself remained silent, but the echoes of his life unsettled generations. To some ancient writers, Sporus embodied the corruption of empire. A youth mutilated to satisfy an emperor's grief, paraded as empress, turned into mockery. He was proof, in their eyes, of decadence unbound, a reminder that when power is absolute, even bodies and identities can be remade into theatre. Christian authors later seized upon his story, casting him as evidence of Rome's immorality. In their narratives, he was less victim than emblem, a warning against pagan vice. Scholars still debate whether this long afterlife of Sporus was more about moral propaganda than historical truth. Yet his legacy is more complex than satire or sermon. Sporus forces us to confront questions that resist easy answers. What does it mean to live a life entirely scripted by others? How do we recover the humanity of someone remembered only through scandal? And how do we honour fragility without erasing resilience? These questions make his story not merely a footnote of Nero's reign, but a haunting case study in the collision of power and personhood. Quirky details still cling to his memory. One late source claims Sporus was spoken of in Rome for decades after, his name whispered whenever discussions of Nero's excesses arose. Another suggests that in some circles his story was told almost as a tragic romance, Nero's impossible attempt to defy death through love. Scholars still debate whether such recollections softened or sharpened the cruelty at the heart of the tale. In modern times, Sporus has become a figure reclaimed and reinterpreted. Some see him as a symbol of resilience against overwhelming oppression, others as a cautionary reminder of how easily history can erase the voices of the powerless. His story unsettles because it is neither simple villainy nor simple victimhood, but a tangle of grief, obsession, violence, and survival. And so Sporus remains, a boy remembered not for his own words, but for the shadows cast upon him by emperors and historians alike. His life was lived in costume, his death chosen in despair, and his memory twisted into parable. Yet behind it all, if we listen carefully, we can still sense the faint trace of a human presence. A fragile figure who once walked Rome's marble halls, veiled as an empress, carrying a story too strange, too painful, and too human to ever be forgotten. Conclusion. The story of Sporus is one of history's most haunting intersections between power and vulnerability. Across 20 centuries, his name has survived not because he ruled, conquered, or created, but because he was transformed, reshaped by an emperor's grief and enshrined in scandal. Through the pens of ancient historians, he became symbol more than self, a mirror of Nero's madness, a pawn of Otho, a victim of Vitellius. Yet when we look beyond the satire and moralizing, we glimpse something more enduring. Sporus was a human being, caught in the orbit of men who saw him as echo, mask, or prop. His silence speaks louder than the laughter of his contemporaries or the condemnation of later ages. To remember him now is to acknowledge not only Rome's capacity for cruelty, but also the quiet dignity of one who endured until he could endure no longer.